Our first speaker is Christian Zillmann from the University of Fribourg on his talk, The Adverse Effects of Monitoring, a Field Experiment. So Christian, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I'm going to talk today about the adverse effects of monitoring, which is a joint work together with Holger Herz. So monitoring is a very, classical management tool. It's omnipresent in a lot of workplaces all around the world. And the use of monitoring theoretically leads to the so-called disciplining effect, according to standard agency theory. So monitoring should increase workers' performance. So why is that? Because it restricts workers from shirking, right? So their action space to behave opportunistically is limited or controlled by the monitoring device. Now recently, some other theories emerged originated by the seminal paper of Falk and Kosfeld in 2006, which is the so-called hidden cost of control effect, or also referred to as the motivational crowding out effect, which posits actually exactly the opposite, namely monitoring decreases workers' performance. And the mechanism at work here is still investigated, but what's suggested is that it's, for example, that workers, perceive monitoring as a signal of distrust, and then retaliate and punish basically the principal, the employer, for being controlled. So however, field experimental evidence is quite scarce and limited to traditional workplace environments. So one of the, let's say, key question in organizational and personal economics is still ambiguous, namely how to govern such employer-employee relationships in real life. Shall we actually implement monitoring or not? So does the use of monitoring have adverse effects? Now what we do specifically in this field experiment is actually what we, in our setting, there's a work from home setting, so everyone works remotely from home. Luckily for us, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this has become more and more relevant for today's world, right? What we also have is a multidimensional productivity setting, so workers provide effort in more than one dimension. More on that later on. And what we investigate here in this field experiment is also a little bit the mechanism, namely, is this effect, if it exists, is it due to a crowding out of intrinsic motivation? So there's a bunch of evidence, especially from the lab. Let me more or less skip this slide for the sake of time. I just want to mention here the last paper, Bello and Schroeder 2016, because that's a framed field experiment, so relatively close to ours. And also it does apply a multidimensional performance setting. All right, now about what we actually do. So we conduct 2 RCTs. They're one-to-one the same, actually. One's the original study, and 2 years later, we replicated it. Both studies were separately pre-registered at the RCT registry and conducted on AMT in a real labor market. So what was the task, or what was basically the purpose? So our employer wanted basically to have pictures categorized, right? Here you have an example of a sports picture. So workers were required or were requested to categorize such pictures and to extract information out of them. For example, here, who or which team is in possession and what's the number of the player who is in possession of the ball. Yes, what's the purpose of such tasks? They are very common on mTORC, because with a human annotated sample, also called the training set, you can then basically feed machine learning algorithms and do the rest, the big chunk of the pictures with an algorithm. But to train the algorithm, you need humans to annotate and to classify these pictures. And this is exactly what they did here. Now, importantly, before they started to extract information out of the picture and insert here in the right, workers needed to decide if they actually can work on that picture or not. Because sometimes pictures are blurry, you know, you don't see all information, they are unreadable. And in such a case, you want that workers declare it as unreadable, as blurry, because to correctly train the algorithm. So rather than entering here random information, you want them to really declare an unclear image as unclear. And then in such a case, the picture is just skipped and you proceed to the next one. Now workers were tasked with transcribing 20 of such pictures. And actually now in task 1, in stage 1, they were paid upfront. They received a flat wage upfront. So you clearly see there's an incentive here to declare pictures as unreadable, because basically you can click on this unclear image button and then skip pictures very fast, receiving the money for doing no work in a sense. So when we talk about the design, this was task 1 or the pre-treatment stage. So all workers received a flat wage upfront. Afterwards, they were offered to do a second task, which was a very similar task, obviously with different pictures. We randomized workers into 2 groups, in the baseline group and the monitored group. The baseline group, again, was not subject to any monitoring mechanism. And for the monitored group, we actually let workers know that we observe, that we monitor the number of clicks on the unclear picture button. And we restricted the maximum allowance to 8 times out of 20. So in other words, workers were required to work on at least 12 out of the 20 pictures. This was kind of a minimum performance requirement. Now, what do we analyze? What's our outcome variables? So first of all, we observe work output, and this is very straightforward. That's simply the number of correctly transcribed pictures out of the 20. So how many pictures do you correctly transcribe and solve? Then workers can actually, there are 2 ways to fail to produce a work output. One way is, to have a readable picture, perfectly readable, but declare it as unreadable, as unclear. So you skip to work on that picture. And this is the monitored dimension. This is the dimension we applied our monitoring mechanism. But you could also, declare a readable picture as readable and then simply, insert incomplete information, random information, etc. So you can transcribe these pictures also with errors. You just do sloppy work in a sense. So output is just basically the sum of skip and errors. So 20 pictures minus the skips and minus the errors yields the output dimension. We also observe work input. On that I will talk about later. So if this behavioral effect exists on average, we should expect workers to reduce their performance once they're monitored, right? In standard agency theory, the hypothesis would be exactly the opposite, namely workers increase performance when monitored. So here we want to test the behavioral effect if it exists on average. Then hypothesis 2 is a little bit more specific because it says, probably our workers, they're heterogeneous. So we may face in our workforce some opportunistic guys, but probably also some motivated guys. And this goes back to Frey 1993 and also Falken-Kosfeld 2006. So what they suggest is that only people who are intrinsically motivated without monitoring, only these people reduce performance once they're monitored. So it's in fact only a subgroup reacts to the monitoring device negatively. by reducing the performance. Hypothesis 3, this is actually a hypothesis I need to say that is a hypothesis we only pre-registered for the replication. It wasn't pre-registered for the first study. So what we hypothesize here is that the negative effect of monitoring is particularly pronounced among the more difficult pictures. Yeah, the more difficult pictures, they require more effort, more time. So if you want to punish the employer because he monitors you, you want to reduce your work performance where you can save most costs in a term of cost of effort, which is among the complex or difficult to solve pictures. All right, let me go straight ahead to the results for hypothesis 1. So here in blue, you see the baseline group. That's the group which was not monitored. In red, you see the monitored group. So workers who were monitored. On the y-axis, it's actually the difference between stage 1 to stage 1, so DID design. What you observe is that baseline group workers, so workers who are not monitored, on average, they provide roughly 0.7 pictures less correctly in stage 2. So the work output is reduced in stage 2 by 0.8. This is probably due because stage 2, you know, was a little bit more difficult. The pictures were a bit more difficult. But the treatment effect you see here clearly is that monitored workers reduce work performance by 1.5, so almost double the size of the baseline group. So indeed, what we can confirm is here, on average, monitoring leads to a decrease in work performance. And I haven't shown you the graphs here due to the sake of time, but what we observe is actually that this effect here is not happening in the monitored dimension. Yeah, namely the dimension we monitored, the baseline workers perform even worse than the monitored workers. But the monitored workers, they reciprocate and reduce their effort in the dimension which is not monitored, which is the error dimension. So they, concretely, they skip less pictures, but they make way more errors because they know that this dimension isn't monitored, right? So result 1 is actually a confirmation of Belot and Schroeder 2016. So we confirm largely their findings. Now we go further. Hypothesis 2 is about a motivational crowding out. So is the effect, the average treatment effect, actually driven by intrinsically motivated people? What we observe here is indeed it is driven by intrinsically motivated people. You see on the left-hand side here in the middle, people with low intrinsic motivation, they do not react at all. There's no significant difference between the two groups. However, there's a highly significant difference in the group of highly intrinsically motivated people. So here I need to say, how did we make these those groups? So we observed time on task. So the time spent on task in stage 1, where all workers were not subject to monitoring. So in absence of any extrinsic incentives, labor input, here effort, is often regarded as intrinsic motivation, right? So here we made a median split and just, you know, created a low and high intrinsic motivation group. We can obviously also do that with the continuous variable in a regression approach, which yields even more robust results. So result 2, the negative performance impact of monitoring is indeed due to the intrinsically motivated workers. Now let us talk about hypothesis 3. So do we observe this crowding out indeed among the challenging pictures, among the more difficult pictures? We categorize pictures into 10 categories. that was objectively based on the pilot baseline group performance. And then here you see the plot, again, baseline in blue and the treatment group, the monitored group, in red. What we observe is that the monitored group performs a little bit better here in the easy picture categories. These are the disciplined workers, the opportunistic workers. So they perform a little bit better here. It's not so significant though, but crucially, the monitored workers who reduce performance, they reduce performance indeed among the more difficult picture categories. And this is very interesting because, you know, the more difficult pictures, they are also solved and thus provided with more scarcity. Yeah? You see here, like the percentage. These pictures are obviously solved with a lower frequency. So in standard economic sense, a scarce resources should be especially valuable. And here you see that the baseline group performs better among the scarce resources. So the motivation crowding out leads to a strong performance reduction among the hard to solve pictures. Now we try to quantify the cost of monitoring for the employer. So what's happening often on mTORC is that you do not know the correct solution, obviously, as an employer. So what you do is you recruit several workers to work on such pictures, and then you have, for example, 10 workers required at minimum to agree on the correct solution. So let's say you recruit 100 workers and you regard the solution as correct if 10 of these workers provide the same response, the same answer. Then you say, okay, then it's likely that the result is correct. So here we did exactly the same. We asked ourselves, how many workers do we need to have 18, for example, here, 18 pictures correctly solved 10 times independently, so by 10 different workers. In the baseline group, we would need to recruit 42 workers. In the monitored, 51. Yeah, so this is a cost increase, quite significant, of 21%. When we aim for 100% accuracy, the cost increase is way smaller because almost no one was able to solve all of the pictures, right? But you see here, like the cost increase is quite substantial, roughly 20% on average. So let me conclude. So what we observe, first of all, is that in the field actually too, monitoring can undermine performance. In our setting, the average cost increase was roughly 20%. That's quite substantial, right? So monitoring crowds out performance, especially among the intrinsically motivated workforce, in non-monitored performance dimensions, and among challenging tasks. So in short, the control-averse reaction here, or the crowding out, is very rich in variety. Now, this is a little bit a disclaimer in a sense. So whether or not the net effect of monitoring is beneficial or detrimental to the principal, to the employer, or neither of both, depends ultimately on the frequency of types in the population, right? So when you are faced with only opportunistic workers and you do not have any intrinsically motivated worker in your workforce, then clearly monitoring will have positive effects. Yeah. However, here we are in an environment which we actually employed as a stress test for this hypothesis. And what we observe, it's the costs of control, the cost of monitoring are quite substantial. And just as a general hypothesis, this goes back to Dickinson and Bilbao 2008, in environments such as ours, where there's no face-to-face interaction, where there's low trust, and a very abstract relationship between employer and employee. Just they don't know each other, right? The costs of monitoring are suggested or believed to be relatively low to traditional workplace environments. And even here we observe quite significant costs. Yeah, that's our conclusion. And I thank you for listening to the presentation.
All right, thanks, Christian. You were perfectly on time. 1 minute left. I didn't interrupt you on the last slide then. So are there any questions of the audience, maybe? Did anyone raise their hand? Yeah, Philip?
I have a clarifying question.
Good.
You said that previously the result was driven in the error dimension, not the monitoring dimension. Was this also true for the intrinsically motivated individuals?
Exactly, yeah. Sorry, this is also a result we have in our paper, exactly. So what's happening is, since we monitor the number of clicks on this unclear image button, right? Everyone or all the workers, they perform either better when they are monitored or the same. So the intrinsically motivated workers, they perform the same as the baseline group when they're monitored in this dimension. So where do they reciprocate? They do reciprocate in the dimension they know we do not monitor. And where they know they do not need to face any punishment, you know.
All right, thanks.
Was this?
Philip, are you satisfied with the answer?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Maybe if I don't see a raise of hands, I go next because I also have a question. I was wondering two things on this crowding out of intrinsic motivation. On the one hand, you have a task which I believe does not include a lot of intrinsic motivation.
Yes, exactly.
So with like a baseline low intrinsic motivation, I believe. So how does this influence your interpretation of the results? And the second and related, the way you measure intrinsic motivation is you say, if I understood it correctly, you take task one and see how much time people spend, more or less, and then take a median split. Does this also have to do with ability and people just do the task longer? I didn't understand if there also was a time limit, or how do you control for ability on the task? Do you do that? And does it mix with your classification of intrinsic motivation maybe?
Okay, so the first question is, indeed, we believe as well that intrinsic motivation is probably low on baseline in such a task, which strengthens our result, yeah, because it's, I mean, what I already said, it's kind of a stress test because intrinsic motivation is believed to be pretty low in such tasks, but even there we observe the crowding out effect. So you don't want to imagine what's happening in, you know, high intrinsic motivation environments. The potential for the crowding out is obviously way larger. For the second, that's in fact, we took the time on task because we believe it's less subject to ability, or it's less confounded by ability than performance. That's why we apply the time on task. But I mean, we cannot fully rebuke this concern. That's true. Still, I mean, we apply the continuous variable. It's super robust there, and even through the median split, where you get rid of quite a lot of groups.
Okay, and lastly, is there anything you control for ability in your regressions then, or kind of it's not really possible then anymore, right?
Yeah,
because some might be really good in this, I believe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, of course. No, what we control for ability is because we have two tasks, so we just enter the pre-treatment, the task one performance. As,
okay,
so it's in a sense fully or pretty good controlled for. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That's it. Are there any other questions, Philip? Do you see a raise of hands at the moment? No?
I think time is over.
Time is over, more or less. Yes. Okay. Well, thanks, Christian, for your presentation. It was very nice hearing this experiment. And then we continue with our second speaker. I think we have to start sharing the screen first. Probably.
All right. Can everyone see?
Yes, we can see it. I think you could go into presentation mode next.
Yeah. It's all good?
It's all good. All right,
Okay.
great. So Daniel, you're next. The floor is yours with your experiment on information intervention to promote safe water consumption and RCT. So please go ahead. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, great. There we go. Sorry. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to present this project. As you said, my name is Daniel. I'm a research fellow at the MPI in Bonn and a PhD candidate at the University of Cologne. And today I'll be presenting this project for the first time, which is called Information Intervention to Promote Safe Water Consumption and RCT in Areas Affected by Groundwater Arsenic in India. And this is a project together with Shambhavi Priyam and Matthias Sutter. So first, some motivation for this project. So there's been a large focus on improving health outcomes over the last decade, and many different tools have been used. One of the important tools have been information interventions with a lot of different success stories. And this has been important both for researchers and policymakers, as information interventions are great in the sense that they are a very low cost tool to use to change actual behavior. And some brief examples of how this has been used. It's been used to inform primary school students in Kenya about HIV/AIDS, or informed about drinking water having fecal contamination, or informing about well safety regarding arsenic levels. While they have proven successful, we still have a limited understanding of how these information interventions really work. Especially in the health context, there have been mixed findings where some interventions have really large effects and others have tiny effects or even null effects. And there's this limited understanding of the mechanisms behind these interventions. And there are many reasons for why we might expect these interventions to have mixed effects. It's been shown throughout the literature that the poor often underexploit high return health investments. It's been shown that they have a lower willingness to pay for preventive health, engage more frequently in unhealthy behaviors, and have a high sensitivity of health investments to price and convenience. So a little bit what we wanted to do with this project was to try to find a context where most people don't have any information about the health context and where it has severe consequences, and where we could address some of these points mentioned here, say high sensitivity of health investment to price and convenience, and see if we could successfully address these points and make an intervention work. And the health context that we choose for this is groundwater arsenic. So a little bit background about groundwater arsenic. Arsenic contaminated groundwater is consumed by approximately 100 million people worldwide and has severe health consequences. As you can see in this map, all the areas that are marked with yellow to orange are areas that are affected with high amounts of arsenic. So you can see that it's spread all over the world. The element is transparent, taste and odorless when dissolved in water, which makes it especially tricky to deal with for a poor rural population that doesn't have any knowledge about this. It's a carcinogen that affects health in both the short term and in the long term. In the short term, it often occurs through skin diseases, as shown in these two pictures that were taken from the study location, but also many other different outcomes, such as mental health has been shown and other outcomes. And in the long term, it has more severe consequences, for example, cancer and lung diseases. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about groundwater arsenic in the area of in the location of the study, which is in Bihar, India, and how groundwater arsenic came to be a problem in this setting. So we are working with the poor rural population of this area. And most of these people were used to rely on surface water as their main source of water. And the problem with surface water was always that it has bacteria in it. So in the 90s, many NGOs started to promote the use of tube wells, which was seen as this great tool in the sense that it's great at providing bacteria-free drinking water. So they started this large promotion of these tube wells and also thought they can be very convenient and be put right outside the household. And they were very successful in making people adopt tube wells. I think today in the rural Bihar, you will find about 90 to 95% of the people have a tube well or use tube well as the main source for water. But the issue in this region was that it was often the case that the water was not right below the surface, so you had to dig deeper. And once you dig deeper than 50 feet, you're starting to hit the arsenic belt, which then made people drink water with arsenic without being aware of it. As I mentioned before, this water, you cannot smell it, you cannot see it, there's no way of indicating it, and you have no prior knowledge. So this meant that many people were consuming this water without being aware of it and becoming sick. So it's also been recently in the media in Bihar that there's been a rise in cancer incidents that has been attributed to the consumption of arsenic water. So we would like to use this setting to understand how an information intervention can work in the setting and improve health behavior. And the main tool we will use to do this is to propose low cost and low effort alternatives for preventive healthcare. Many of the previous papers working on arsenic water has often the method is to test arsenic water and then ask the household to switch to a different water source, to a different tube well. It's often the way that's been used. And this is sort of problematic in the sense that it's been shown that often households don't know where to get this new water source. So they would switch to maybe a different tube well that also has arsenic or a higher amount of arsenic, which may make it even worse. And convenience is again an important factor here. So most people don't want to go too far away or spend too much money on this. So to the research questions of this project. So we want to ask, are more people in the treatment group adopting healthy water treatment practices? So people in the information intervention. And then does this information intervention actually affect measured arsenic levels, which will be sort of our objective measure of the effects of this intervention? And finally, does these changes in arsenic translate to better health outcomes? So a little bit background about, more background about the study design. So the baseline survey and intervention were conducted in January 2020 in Bihar, India. And we used a cluster randomization design that was pre-registered. At baseline, we recruited 2,334 households from 156 different villages. And we targeted the low caste hamlets in the village, which is the poorest area of the village. This is where most people are financially and politically disadvantaged and unaware of being affected by groundwater arsenic, and also the people that are the most exposed to the problem of groundwater arsenic. And we then collected an online survey 8 weeks after the intervention. For the analysis later, the sample will be somewhat reduced due to online data collection being halted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically what would happen in the timeline would be that we would collect the baseline and have the intervention at the end of the baseline, and then come back 8 weeks after and collect the end line. So now some more details about what actually was this information intervention. So our information intervention package had the following components. First, the component was an audiovisual, which informed about groundwater arsenic and how to deal with the problem. And the next component was an arsenic test, which informed if the household did have a problem with groundwater arsenic or not. So more about this audiovisual. So we had an 8-minute long audiovisual that presented information about the dangers of consuming arsenic contaminated water, common misconceptions, and effective low-cost solution to the problem. And the information in this audiovisual was from UNICEF and the World Bank, and also approved by local bodies in Bihar. And the information in the audiovisual was presented by local experts that worked on arsenic, and also villagers in the area that had previous experiences in dealing with arsenic. And the control group was shown an audiovisual of the same length, unrelated to water or groundwater arsenic. Next, the component arsenic test. We used this to test the primary drinking water source of the household, and we used the ITS arsenic EconoQuick field test kits. And this takes about 15 minutes from you get a water sample to conduct the test and get the results. And in the end, it will look like the picture shown, where you can match it on this scale and find the actually measured level of arsenic. And we use this to inform the household of the measured level of arsenic, and we inform them if this was above or below the recommended WHO levels. And the results were provided to the respondent alone. And in the control group, the households were not informed of the results. So a little bit more breakdown of how we did this with the treatments. So we had this one pure control group, where they were shown an audiovisual completely unrelated to arsenic or water. They were shown an audiovisual about tiger conservation, and they were not informed about the arsenic test results. And then we had a main treatment group where they were shown this audiovisual related to arsenic and telling about how they could deal with the problem and introducing the problem of arsenic. And they were informed about the results of the arsenic test and if this was above or below the recommended WHO levels. And then from this, we had two different treatments that we did. We had an individual treatment where people were shown this audiovisual individually, alone. And we had a group treatment where they were shown this audiovisual in groups of 3 households together. For the rest of this presentation, I will treat them as the same, as the effects of these two were fairly similar. And here you can see a map of the randomization. So you can see that we randomized all these different villages to these 3 different treatments, so either into the control group, the group treatment, or the individual treatment. And you can see that all these villages were situated along the river, where most people are affected by arsenic. And you can also see in the top right corner of the map where in India this study was conducted. So now I will move on to the results. So the first research question that we asked was, are more people in the treatment group adopting healthy water treatment practices? And yes, here we do see a positive change in adopting these water treatment practices that were promoted in this audiovisual. So we see in column 1 that there's a positive change here. And we wanted to break it down further. And then, as you can see in column 2, this was both by an increasing in healthy practices, and in column 3, a decrease in unhealthy water treatment practices. So, for example, unhealthy water treatment practice would be to switch from a tubewell that had arsenic to surface water that you treat for bacteria. Or, for example, a different trick that was promoted is that you could, if you had a tubewell with arsenic, you could put water in a bucket and put a cloth over it and leave it overnight. And then the next day you will be able to consume the top half without having any problems with arsenic. An example of an unhealthy treatment practice would be to have a tubewell with arsenic that you then boil before you use. The problem with boiling this water is that you concentrate the quantity of arsenic even more and makes it more dangerous to consume. So this would be an example of an unhealthy practice. Next, we asked if this information intervention affected arsenic levels. And yes, we do see a slight reduction in measured arsenic quantity, as shown here in column 1. And we can also see that in column 2 and 3, that the information intervention was effective in actually spreading information, in the sense that more people state that they have knowledge about arsenic, and also scoring higher on a knowledge score. And then we looked a little bit deeper into the mechanisms of this intervention. So here you can see in the first row, we just see the characteristics of people being in the treatment. And the one under there, we look at characteristics of people having a change in arsenic level. And then finally, the last row is the combination of these two. So people in the treatment that actually had a change in the measured arsenic level. And interestingly, we can see in column 5 that the treatment was actually pretty effective in making people think that they have the choice with water treatments, that more people are likely to think that poor people actually do have a choice when it comes to water treatments. So our information seems to be effective in this way. They were also, as shown in column 6, more likely to have talked about arsenic in the past month. And as I just said before, in column 7 and 8, have a higher knowledge about arsenic, which seems to be a slight push into making this change. Finally, we asked if we could see these changes could lead to better health outcomes. And we don't see any clear changes here in the short term. Again, this was about 8 weeks after the intervention. And we don't see any clear differences here. The only thing that we see that is significant is we see a reduction in mental health issues here, depression measured by the PHQ-9 that we see in the treatment groups as compared to the control group. So I'm already done. So just to summarize, we have shown that our information intervention successfully changed water treatment practices, which were in this setting of groundwater arsenic through this promotion of low cost and low effort practices. And this is supported by a reduction in arsenic levels and an increase in knowledge about arsenic. As of now, we don't see any clear effects on health outcomes in the short term. But as next steps, we would like to increase the power of the study to substantiate current results. So we're currently planning to go back into the field and collect data from the whole baseline again. So the whole sample of 2,400 households and measured arsenic, and see if these, also investigate if these very long-term effects of this intervention. So this will be the next steps that we will be interested in. So thank you very much for listening in. I'm looking forward to any feedback that you might have, any comments, and also feel free to email me if you have any thoughts about the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Daniel. I think in the last minute we lost your camera. I'm not sure if you're aware of this.
I see it.
Okay, great. But yeah, you were perfectly on time.
Okay,
we
great.
have 5 minutes of discussion. Philip, can you see any raising hands? I see some questions. Could you unmute those people?
Daniel, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. So Daniel, thanks a lot. This is a really nice presentation. Just one simple question. So the one thing you noticed was regarding the mental health, right? That was affected. Do you have some maybe intuition on that?
So there has actually been a paper before that have shown effects of arsenic on mental health. I am not so sure. I'm really interpreting it a little bit not too strong, because we were also surprised to find effects in such a short term on mental health. So I think I would not really interpret it too strongly before we get more evidence on it.
But I guess in long term you'll be you will check this again, right? If you go longer. Okay, that'll be really interesting. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Philip, I think you're unmuting someone else.
Hi. Can I go ahead? Yeah. Okay. Good talk. Good talk, Daniel. I had a couple of questions. First of all, so what was actually there in the information packet? It was about information about arsenic plus what you have to do to get rid of arsenic, including, for example, this healthy water practices, unhealthy water practices. So you cannot really separate out what really worked, right? It was a bundle of things.
Yeah, it's definitely right. It's a bundle of things. So the video kind of first introduced the problem. What is arsenic? How is it dangerous? How does it affect your health? And then the next part was, as you say, promoting these different techniques that they could deal with the issue. And then finally saying that this is an issue that affects many people in this region and that you should be aware of it, sort of. So this was kind of the breakdown of the audiovisual.
Right. And a follow-up question is, so, you talked briefly about the individual treatment versus group treatment. I guess that meant that individual treatment people were shown the video one by one on their own, as opposed to in the group treatment, they were shown as a part of a group. And we know that, private information has weaker effects than public information, right? So you didn't talk at all about it. Can you say anything about whether you saw any difference in the individual versus group treatment, because you kind of combined everything into treatment group? Yeah.
So our motivation with adding the group treatment is exactly as you said, that we would think that people would be more effective in watching this video together, and that you can then more easily talk to other people and deal with this issue and think about possible concerns and being together, and more realizing that this is a common issue. As of now, I didn't talk so much about it because we don't have the power to really say something at this stage, because our sample was reduced due to COVID. Actually, we see a little bit stronger effects in the individual treatment, but this is very slight, and I wouldn't overinterpret this because of the power. But that's what we can see. Except for that, we don't see any big changes, differences between these two at the moment.
Right. Good. Good, thanks.
All right, I think we can deal with one more question. There's one raising hand I at least can see.
I think they already asked their question, but I asked them to.
Perfect. No, that's good. Maybe I can finish off with a question then, as we have like 1 minute left. So Daniel, thanks for your nice presentation. I was wondering one thing about your treatment intervention, because you said there was this information packet audio stuff, and then you had also the test, right? Separately. So you cannot distinguish if it's poorly that people know that their water is pretty bad or good or medium good, or because you educated them. Why did you don't separate this? Have you thought about this, or?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the reason why we wanted to make this into sort of an information intervention package is that we really felt that neither of these two information alone would give you the appropriate way to react to the problem.
Okay.
So the issue with in our view, is to just inform them of, say, just the arsenic test, is that, great, I have something in my water, but I don't know what it is and how to deal with this. Right. So I think also usually in other interventions, they tell you a little bit of information, but basically what we would do is to extend this much more and give much more alternatives and focus on that. So that was the reasoning for why we wanted to do that.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. All right, then, well, thanks for the presentation and discussion. I would say then we move on to our third speaker. This is Duan Su. Hello.
Hello.
Could you start sharing your screen? That would be great.
Yeah. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides. I think you could put them in presentation mode if you want.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so go ahead with your field experiment on promoting considerate parking behavior with social norms, a field experimental study. You have 20 minutes and I will, so the floor is yours basically.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm glad to report my study here. And the co-author of this study is Professor Wang and Professor Fu from BGTU and the Professor Lian from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Since the introduction of dockless bike sharing in China, it has become the most popular travel mode for city dwellers, and it is often used in the last mile of commuting. This study uses insights from behavioral economics to test the effectiveness of different social norm information on promoting orderly parking behavior in a field experiment. We have 3 research questions that can social norm information promote cyclist proper parking behavior? And the second, is there any difference between positive social norm information and negative social norm information? Are there framing effects? Third, which type of social norm information can improve parking behavior more effectively? Test or picture. In this study, we interact the framing effects, the positive or negative attitudes, and the different forms, the test or picture, to create 4 information strategies of social norms. And okay, let me introduce what's the dockless bike sharing. The dockless sharing have 5 characteristics, and the most important is that people can access the bicycles and park bicycles anywhere and at any time. The new fashion makes the dockless bike sharing very popular, and it has become the one of 3 public travel modes in China, as well as subway and bus. However, the innovation also brings troubles to public management, as the first 4 picture shows that many users don't park their bicycles in the area not suitable for parking, such as on the road at the entrance and the exit of traffic passage. And even in the areas suitable for parking, many users park bicycles without a tidy placement. And the disorderly parking of dockless bike sharing also makes the disorderly parking of private bicycles frequent. Administrators have to repark these bicycles to maintain order, but however, this is an expensive labor cost and with less efficiency. Thus, effective management is needed to be introduced to address disorderly parking. Scholars have done some exploratory research about how to reduce disorderly parking, mainly about optimizing operation and management, but less focusing on the disorderly parking behavior. Some studies about the disorderly parking behavior mainly use surveys and laboratory experiment to explore the influential factors. But this 2 method is not suitable for our research question, because disorderly parking is not advocated by the society, and subjects are less likely to report their disorderly parking. For now, we only find those who use the randomized control trials to explore how to reduce disorderly parking. This is some reviews about the social norm information and framing effects. We find that previous studies mainly tested the effectiveness of positive social norms and the textual information on inducing proper behavior. Now we find the last study considering the positive and negative norm information meanwhile and evaluate their difference. And no study evaluates the difference between the textual information and the pictorial information of social norms. I will introduce our field experiments on the following pages. Before experiments, we have a clear definition about what's the orderly parking. There are two measures. First, whether the bicycle is parked in right areas, and the second, whether the bicycle is parked with tidy placement. In our experiment, we consider both measures to define orderly parking. And to capture the real reach of orderly parking and avoid deception in designing treatments, we conduct a non-treatment observation at the two parking locations in our university for 5 days in November 2018. The table shows the main results of pre-experiment, and we collect a total of 426 parking instances. Averaging the 10 percentages in the table, we calculate that the rate of orderly parking is 73%. We use this figure to design our treatment. We have 4 treatments in our experiment. We deliver the social norm information from the positive attitude or negative attitude in the form of text or picture. The first 2 are textual expressions. The positive text treatment tells people 73% cyclists park bicycles in right areas and with tidy placement. The negative text treatment tells people 27% of cyclists park bicycles not in right areas and without tidy placement. The positive picture treatment has the same topic with PT, but in the form of picture, and the negative picture also has the same topic with NT, but in the form of picture. Okay, this is our treatment science, and the first 2 are textual information and tell people how others park bicycles in the form of text. The last 2 signs are pictorial information, and in each picture there are 6 bicycles parked in order and 2 bicycles parked in disorder. The rate of orderly parking rate is 75%, which approximately equals the figure of positive text treatment. This science, and at the bottom of this science, there are badges of our university to increase persuasion. This science will hang on the wall or poster stands in the locations, and which make cyclists can see them directly. This table shows our treatment arrangement to reduce the noise from different locations. We post none or one of four signs in one location for 2 days and then replace them in turn. Thus, we make a random distribution of treatment on days and locations. We began to treatment from April 29 to June 14th, and we began to observe the parking before 1 week. And then after the treatment ended, we continued to observe the parking. We observe the parking instance from the videos in the locations, and there are 3 observation seats. The experiment lasted about 2 months, and about 6 weeks are during treatment. However, some unexpected factors arise. For example, the gather blew down the signs and the camera suddenly didn't work, which and we didn't collect all data. In this table, the gray grids shows the valid data, and the white grids mean the data is missing and or is not collected successfully. And through videos, we record the parking instance and in every location, and then code the variables, mainly about including the research variable and the demographics and the conditions of cyclists, and the type of bicycle, and the conditions of locations. Okay, in this table, we show the descriptive statistics, and we collect a total of 3,556 records and 1,482 records are for shared bicycles. Other records are for private bicycles and electric bicycles. The figures plot the rate of orderly parking of control group and treatment groups. Okay, the left figure are described from our data set, as it shows the PT treatment and the PP treatment increase the possibility of orderly parking relative to the baseline. And the negative treatment also increase the possibility of subjects parking with tidy placement. In the right figure, we deleted the data of first week and the last week of experiment. The effects of two negative treatments are weakened. Overall, we can see that the positive treatment play an important role, and the negative treatment also have minor nudging effects. The manual Whitney test show that we found that there's an obvious difference between the positive treatment and the negative treatment, but there's no obvious difference between the texture treatment and pictorial treatment. In order to get more accurate results, we estimate a logistic regression as follows. The dependent variable is whether the bicycle is parked in right areas or with tidy placement or both. And the independent variables includes the treatment variables and other control variables. This table shows the main results of our regressions. We will discuss it in more detail on the next page. From this table, we can see PT treatment and PP treatment are estimated to be statistically significant in promoting cyclist parking bicycles, both in right areas and with tidy placement. And the negative text treatment doesn't work on any behavioral shift, and the negative picture treatment work on inducing parking with tidy placement. The marginal effect indicates that the PT treatment promotes another 12% orderly parking, and the PP treatment encourages 11% orderly parking. We have some explanations about this result. For the pure effects, negative framing doesn't have as much as an effect of positive. It may be that 27% of people do poor parking is a natural signal to subjects, high enough that they don't feel so bad to join the 27%. However, previous studies found that negative norm information often play a negative role in inducing proper behavior. Okay, in this page, there are also other interesting findings. We find that the more bicycles in parking locations, the less likely cyclists will make orderly parking. It is easy to understand that the crowded parking seat is not conducive to people's orderly parking. Second, the more orderly parking bicycles in parking locations can increase the probability of orderly parking. This may be a kind of social norm cues which represent the majority of people are doing proper things. The two variables of during and post represent whether the record is in the during or post treatment, and they indicate that the treatments gradually help people from orderly parking habits. However, we can't know exactly which treatment is playing a long-term role, maybe all of them. Okay, in that table, we interact our treatment variables with the amount of other bicycles and the amount of other orderly parking bicycles. In the table, all interactions are significant and all treatments are working. And we can find that more bicycles in locations or more orderly parking bicycles in the location can strengthen the effectiveness of all treatments. Okay, here we also have two explanations. We get more bicycles induce cyclist attention and make treatment silence. And there are relationships between the social norm cues and the social norm informations. In the last table, we conduct logit regressions of different channels, and we find that only PT treatment works on the shared bicycle cyclist, and the PT treatment and the PP treatment affect the private bicycle cyclist statistically. And the PT, NT, and the PP treatment all works on electric bicycles. This table also confirms that the positive treatment work better than the negative treatment, and there's no obvious difference between the test and the picture. Okay, lastly, we make a conclusion. In this study, we post the science of different social norms in a field experiment and explore their effectiveness. And we find that positive effects of positive social norm information, both in the text or picture, and the pictorial information of negative norm only work on inducing tidy placement. Our study also can contribute to some literature about the Douglas back sharing and the social norm information. First, we introduced the RCT and the social norm information into the travel behavior management. And second, we find pointing out a significant majority of people are following improper behavior can enhance such behavior of others. And we also find that the negative norm information is maybe a kind of natural signal to individuals. Our finding may have can have some practical implications for the administrators and bike sharing companies. For example, the companies can send the positive social norm information to the users, and because it can influence users' behavior, and it is a very cheap treatment with very low cost. Surely, we also have some limitations. The first, we don't explore the long-term effects of treatment and analyze the heterogeneity of subjects. And the second, subjects are affected by many interventions. With the experiment going on, the effect of treatments is not pure. Future research, I think, should go beyond the campus and nudge and observe users' long-term behavior with the bike sharing service. Thanks for your listening. Yes.
All right, thanks a lot, Tuanso, for your very nice presentation. Philip, can you see any raise of hands at the moment?
Okay.
Not yet. maybe I go first with a question then, and another one pops up. So Donso, I was wondering, one of your intervention was basically, you call it social norm, and you take it as a baseline that like 33% of people apparently do comply with correct parking, right? You take this from a pre-observation phase. Oh, that's the timer, sorry.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is pretty high, right? It seems like there's no problem. So if I would see something that 75%, like 3/4 of people comply with parking, I wonder if you can scale this to other areas, because as you have shown in the pictures, or as I also know from European cities, this parking is really a problem. And I never had the feeling that so many people apparently comply. So in your campus setting, it worked, but so generally like a positive social norm can only work if there is a positive social norm. But this was very specific to your place, I feel.
Yes.
Do you have, or how, so meaning, can you extend your findings? How would you do it in a place where there is no positive social norm? So there are not 80% of people apparently complying. So it's very difficult to use the same message, right?
Oh, okay, because the economic experiment don't like the deception. If we and if we set the very high level figure, like for example, we say the 80% of people are park bicycles in order, or the 100% of people park bicycle in order, which is a deception, and so we get this figure from pre-experiment to avoid the deception. Yes, I think this is related. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's fine. Thanks. I think there's a raising hand in the meantime. Could it be?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Right. Good talk. So my question is, this is not directly a relevant question given your experiment. I wonder whether this is in terms of heterogeneity. For example, does the time of day matter in terms of people conforming to the positive message or the negative message and so on? So, people do something because they're worried, what will others think, right? If you see the positive message, then you still park badly. Some people might think, oh, the others who are walking around might think I'm not a nice person. But in the evening time, nobody can see that. They just go ahead and I don't care. Do you see that behavior happening?
Yes, yeah. So I think there may be also the relationship between the norm treatment and the actual norms in the locations. If some subjects often see the disorderly parking in his life, maybe the treatment can't work on him or her. Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Duansu. I think anyway, running out of question time. And well, yeah, thanks for your presentation and the nice discussion. And I would say we move on to the last speaker, which is myself in this case. And I think I would start sharing my screen.
Okay.
Okay, I think you can see it already. All right, so I'll try to take my time. Okay, so we're coming to the last talk, which is myself. I'm Elisabeth, and I'm going to present a field experiment on discrimination and immigration, some field experimental evidence from Austria, which is some joint work with Daniel Müller. And in this presentation, or in this study, we actually want to test the hypothesis if there is discrimination towards immigrants, or if there exists ethnic discrimination in Austria, and if so, if contact or interaction between locals and foreigners or immigrants can reduce discriminatory behavior. We believe, in particular, the later point with respect to contact and interaction is pretty relevant, because if we have seen in the last years, in particular, Europe has seen a surge in immigration, particularly referring to the so-called immigration crisis or refugee crisis 2015 and 16. And there are unfortunately so far very few papers which check if the presence of more immigrants or migrants or refugees has led to changes in public attitudes, or what we look at in discriminatory behavior. So undeniably, we believe, as we are conducting this study, that discrimination, prejudice, hostility towards other group members or immigrants in particular exist, and is in many instances very costly for society. In economics in particular, in recent years, we have seen an increasing number of papers which deal with the measurement of discrimination. This had particularly also to do with the rise in field experiments. So there has been an increasing amount of experimental field studies, audit, or so-called correspondence studies, as much as there's also now laboratory evidence in economics, which document in particular, so we are interested in ethnic discrimination. Besides that, this paper also deals with the question not only with a clean and a very comprehensive measurement, but also we would like to answer somehow the question, what works to counter discrimination? So how can we alleviate this toxic phenomenon? One idea we are going to focus on, because there might be other solutions obviously to it, is the so-called contact hypothesis, which was originally proposed by Alport already in the 1950s. And this contact hypothesis assumes that contact between locals and foreigners can reduce prejudice between group members. Many papers have set out to test this hypothesis since the 1950s. And what we have seen when we looked at the literature is that evidence on it is not very clear. It can go either direction. And also many studies, also amongst others, because a lot of studies has been conducted in sociology and psychology, have some methodological weaknesses with respect to the measurement in this case. And we aim to try to fill this gap a little bit in the literature.
Elizabeth, sorry to interrupt you, it's Christian. There are comments in the chat that your slides are tiny.
Okay, so I can, that's, okay, let me just stop the screen sharing for a second. And I'll try to put it on my other screen, maybe this helps. Let me just give a second. Thanks for notifying me.
You can also, if you do it on the normal screen, you can normally select what area of the screen it's sharing. And if you just select that window, it might fix the problem.
Yeah, let's try to do that. Is it better now?
Yes.
Yes,
Perfect.
okay, great. Okay, sorry for my micro slides. We improved this now. So to what type of literature we are contributing? Basically kind of two fields. On the one hand, we see our paper in this field experimental evidence on discrimination. There have been a bunch of papers, mainly on correspondence studies in the labor market, like curriculum, CV correspondence studies, a couple of overview papers. The paper we are closest to is the paper by Guiletti et al. From 2019, which use audit study as well to study racial discrimination in the public sector in the US. And more recently also, there has been a lot of type of audit studies in new online marketplaces such as Airbnb, Uber, eBay, etc. Besides that, we see our paper also contributing to this literature on the contact hypothesis, which there's a bunch of papers in sociology and psychology where basically originally, where the hypothesis was proposed initially. In economics, we have a couple of papers in political economy, which have exploited randomized allocation of refugees and have exclusively looked at voting behavior. So we are using their approach, but we use a discrimination behavior. And more recently, there are a couple of also randomized control trials in economics, which exploit a random allocation of people. It's a paper by Corno et al., which randomly allocates roommates in student dorms in South Africa, and 2 more papers by Lowe and Musa, which basically randomly allocate team members of sports team in order to study, I think, prejudice with respect to caste in India and with respect to religious affiliations. I think the latest study by Musa et al. Was conducted in Afghanistan. So our contribution, we see a couple of points we make. On the one hand, our measurement is quite comprehensive, which allows us to generate a type of nationwide index of discrimination in Austria. So we not only provide new clean measurement, but also comprehensive measurement. We introduce treatments where we hope can have some suggestive evidence on the nature of discrimination to be able to distinguish between statistical and taste-based. And we link our discrimination index to a couple of issues in order to what can explain discrimination: economic, social conditions, political ideology, voting, survey attitudes, competition, etc. And finally, we contribute as we evaluate the contact hypothesis, combining our field experiment with a type of natural experiment. So how does our experiment look like? We conduct an email-based correspondence experiment or study. In total, we send out 20,000 emails or email inquiries to public service offices and private businesses in Austria, recording the zip code of the receiver. We in fact cover the universe of communities, which there are like roughly 2,090 in Austria. However, we exclude the biggest cities, so we did not target cities above 50,000 people. But we have all other community cities, villages below that threshold. Our email inquiries consisted of a very short text. Usually we asked for opening hours, appointments, additional information about the service, etc. Most importantly, as you're doing correspondence or audit studies, we randomize the name of the sender and so the email address itself. And this was used in order to signal ethnicity, which we basically define by local ethnicity or foreign ethnicity. For that, we used common Austrian names, which we draw from a list of the most common names in Austria, and ended up with Michael Gruber. And we also used an Arabic sounding name. We went for Arabic sounding name in order to signal immigrant identity, as in particular the recent search of refugees from the refugee crisis to 15 to 16, so mainly immigrants from Arabic countries in Austria, which was mainly Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, etc. So for that reason, we wanted to signal a name from that origin, and we also validated those names beforehand in an online survey in order to really make sure that the names we choose were signaling the right identity or the identity we wanted them to signal. So here's a template of such an email. We use first last name, so the name was already visible in the email address, and was also signaled in the email text. So my name is, there was a standard inquiry text, and the email was also signed with the respective name, be it either local or foreign, as we call it here. We also introduced some treatments. First of all, we use a random assignment procedure. This means each recipient in our email database we have of roughly 27,000 emails is only approached by one sender, either a local email or a foreign email. We randomize, in addition, people or receivers in the following treatments. So we have a neutral email, the email you just have seen. And we use our treatments in order to test or in order to signal a social status. We have a low status treatment where we include spelling mistakes, which basically should signal low education. And we use a high status treatment where we use a doctor title in the signature, which should signal higher socioeconomic background, higher education. We believe that these treatments can help us to get into the difference of statistical and taste-based discrimination, as statistical discrimination would assume that people use group characteristics such as socioeconomic background in order to infer characteristics about the individual, so it's an information problem. And taste-based discrimination would say that basically people dislike interacting with those people irrespective of their socioeconomic background. So those are a number of valid observations at the end, which we have around 25,000. Roughly 9,000 sent to the public sector offices, and roughly 15,000 sent to the private sector, distinguished by either neutral, with spelling mistakes, and with doctor title. We did not signal high socioeconomic status in the public treatment, as we did not have sufficient emails for that based on our calculations when we conducted the experiment. A little bit of logistics. So how did this look like? For the public sectors, we used municipalities, schools, kindergartens to send our emails. For private businesses, lawyer, banks, restaurants, painters, car mechanics, etc. The way we selected those, so basically we had two search criteria. Whom to contact was, on the one hand, we wanted the service to be representative on an average village or community level in Austria, so available. And the second was that it was possible for us to get those email addresses, either through a public directory or that they are publicly accessible. So we did not buy any email addresses. The experiment was conducted in November, December last year, and emails were always sent in the morning. All responses we received, basically we recorded until January. And in case we received a response, we tried to politely decline all responses within roughly 1 day in order to not make it too costly for the recipient to interact with us. So how do our results look like? Results are basically two sections. First, I deal with measurement. We use the difference in response rate to the local and foreign email address as our measure of discrimination. We use our treatments to test assumption about the mechanism. And out of the response rate, we also create an index, so-called discrimination index at the community level in Austria, and can relate it to a couple of characteristics at the community level in order to answer the question if we can explain discrimination. And finally, we link our data set to another data set, so a natural experiment from the refugee crisis in 2015, where we tried to exploit the plausible random allocation of refugees and so presence of refugees and foreigners at the community level. With respect to measurement, so is there discrimination? What you can see here is response rate to our emails, all emails with a local name versus all emails with a foreign name. Clearly, it's visible that foreign emails obtain less responses. In this case, in 52% of the cases, and local emails in roughly 67% of cases. So this 15% difference is statistically significant and it's substantial. So the difference in response rate here, 15%, is our measure of discrimination. Does this differ between the public and the private sector? What you can see here to the left are the two bars, what happens to emails to private businesses of a foreigner, and to the right, what happens to emails to public offices from a foreigner and a local. And what you can see here, also graphically, that we have a little less overall discrimination in the public sector. So overall, we have higher response rates in the public sector. And also the difference, so the difference between the bars is slightly smaller in the public sector. So we see a difference in response rate of roughly 10% in the public sector, and a difference in response rate of roughly 15% in emails to the private sector. Is it taste-based or statistical based? Here you can see our treatment split up by neutral emails, our spelling treatment, low economic status, and our doctor title, high economic status. And I think you can already see it from the bars. There's hardly any effect. If we include spelling mistakes, which would make it even more costly to probably interact with this person, or if we include a doctor title, which should signal high socioeconomic status. As we don't see any difference in our treatment interventions, we kind of think that we have suggestive evidence that the discrimination we see is rather taste-based, so people just dislike interacting with those people irrespective of their socioeconomic background. So it's yeah, this utility of just basically writing back to this person. To recap on the response rate, so on average we have like a difference in response rate of roughly 15%. It's a little bit low in the public sector with 10 compared to the private sector. And to put this into perspective, the closest study is Gioletti et al., who study discrimination in the public sector. And they find a gap of 3%. So this means, compared to our result of 10%, that this effect we find is quite substantial. We have little to no direct effect of our treatment interventions, so we believe to have some suggestive evidence of taste-based discrimination. We also create the discrimination index at the community level. This index is created by taking the response rate of the local emails minus the response rate of the foreign emails. At the community level, we have between 10 to 50 emails which we send out per community. So these are all municipalities in Austria. And the index runs from -100 to +100. Everything above, also the higher and the more positive, or the higher and positive are darker colors, means higher discrimination in those municipalities. So the dark blue have a high discrimination index than the light blue. What is already visible here is that so there's heterogeneous discrimination. Municipalities obviously differ if they discriminate or not on average. We also put this in a regression framework to answer the question, can we explain discrimination at the community or municipality level? And there are basically two interesting observations. This is a two-page table with a couple of covariates: population, unemployment, share of people who live there. And the observations are, first, it's very hard to predict. We have hardly anything which do predict our discrimination index. Second, definitely voting for the far right, which is the Freedom Party here, does not predict discrimination either, something which has been found in the literature, at least with respect to public attitudes towards immigrants. But interestingly, the share of foreigners across all our specifications is significant in predicting less discrimination. We interpret this as a type of sorting effect, so foreigners seem to sort into communities with probably less discrimination. But generally speaking, very hard to predict. We have a number of covariates and we're still collecting some, but not much has turned out to be related to our discrimination index. Summarize, hard to predict, no role for standard sociodemographics, one exception, share foreigners. We believe somehow consistent with a sorting effect, and conclusion similar if we take all emails, private businesses or public sector separately. And finally, to conclude with our contact hypothesis, so what we do is we merge our revealed measure of discrimination with a type of natural experiment from 2015. There was a large influx of refugees in Austria. With the onset of the crisis, authorities had to search for new accommodations. And there's one variable which predicts hosting of refugees in 2015 to 2016 very well, namely empty buildings at the municipality level, which we take from a housing survey from 2011. So we know how many empty buildings are at this municipality. And the assumption is that those empty buildings are only related to discrimination via the number of refugees and not related to any public attitudes or something similar of the population. So we take an instrumental variable strategy which has also been used by Steinmeier for like a plausible exogenous allocation and so contact with immigrants. But Steinmeier used it in a political economy framework to look at voting behavior, particularly speaking to the far-right voting. So here you can see the refugee crisis, which clearly 1516 was a great outlier and increased the probability of having contact with immigrants at the municipality level. We check first for the validity of our instrument and so regress the number of refugees in 2015 to 16 in those municipalities on empty buildings and see that our buildings are very well predictor of the number of refugees. And so we are quite convinced that we can use it as an instrumental variable. In doing so, we restrict our sample to municipalities below 15,000. That's probably one restriction I should mention. We do so because above 15,000 inhabitants per municipality, we don't have any variation, as all municipalities above 15,000 hosted refugees at some point in 2015 and 2016. And we have variation below 15,000. But what do we find in our instrumental variable strategy? Coefficient of interest is how many refugees were there at the start of 2016. So 4 months later, roughly, from the refugee crisis in September, August 2015. And we regress it on our discrimination index and find basically no effect. In across specifications, and also here I only show the sample restriction below 15,000, but also if we change those sample restrictions, there are hardly any changes in the estimations you see here. Okay, so in this respect, we have no evidence for causal effect of contact or presence of foreigners on our discrimination index, and the conclusions are so far robust to a couple of things we have tried. To summarize, so we study discrimination in a type of nationwide correspondence study, so very comprehensive. We document a couple of empirical facts. First of all, we find discrimination against foreigners. We also find that usually discrimination seems to be lower in the public than in the private sector. We have some evidence that it's rather taste and statistical based, looking at our treatments. We believe linking our discrimination index to a lot of covariates, that it's largely unrelated to kind of economic and socio-demographic factors, as much as political ideology or voting for the far right. And finally, exploiting or linking our revealed measure to the natural experiment from 2015, we at least have no indication the contact reduces discrimination, it should say here. And finally, a couple of things we're still doing. We would like to link our measure to local data on competitiveness in all our emails we send to private businesses to see if competition influences discrimination of those companies. We would like to make use of sentiment analysis to code the tone of our email responses we received. We're still looking for a couple of more covariates in our regressions at the community level, and we would hope to make our data set also available to other researchers, and that those might be able to link it to their own service or studies they are running in Austria. All right, I think with that I conclude, and I leave probably this slide on in case there are any questions on the results. Yes, I see one hand.
If I still have time, Elizabeth, I would have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I was just wondering, I'm not an expert in discrimination at all, but with your hypothesis about the, the effects of taste versus statistical discrimination, one would basically need to assume that when I received the email with a spelling error, I would classify foreigners or a German or an Austrian name into the same socioeconomic group, right? This is basically the identifying assumption behind it, isn't it?
Yeah, we kind of fix the socioeconomic background with it.
Okay, but do you have any evidence?
Regardless of the email name, exactly. That's hypothesis behind it.
Yeah, but do you have any evidence that, I mean, because when I receive an email and I know he's native speaker of German and makes a spelling mistake, I will classify him in a lower socioeconomic group than, you know, a foreigner, which obviously is not native in the language. So I was wondering, is that standard procedure, or, I mean, you don't find any effects, but just from
exactly. So I was very careful because I've always said it's suggestive evidence, but yes, it's pretty standard procedure. So we took it from other experiments, and it is a bit debated if we fix the socioeconomic background of both people, basically, if this really can tell us so much about statistical and taste-based. But to some extent, yeah, we do fix the socioeconomic background, so at least there are no other beliefs people should have if they're low educated, and it's very costly to interact with them. But it's true, it's that's why it's suggestive evidence, because we follow some procedure other people have followed. Yeah, it's a careful interpretation, let's say, but it's a good question.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
There's another question from Sigrid.
Yes, thanks. So Elizabeth, very nice talk, very interesting.
Thanks.
I have a question on your results related to the effect of contact. So I wonder, I think what you can do with your data is to vary the level of aggregation, right? So now you community level. So in a recent paper that we find that uses panel data, we find actually that matters a great deal. So if contact is really defined at a close neighborhood, where you can actually say that, you know, having, let's say, 100 new refugees in your close neighborhood brings a higher likelihood of actual personal contact than having 100 refugees at the municipality level.
Yeah.
We see that makes a very big difference. So we find positive effects at the close neighborhood level, and if anything, negative effects at the farther away level, where you can argue that maybe there's not really actual personal contact going on, like through the school system or you know. So I wonder whether you tried to do a thing like this with your data. I think it's possible, right?
Well, thanks a lot for this good hint. So we have thought about aggregating it higher, but it doesn't help us because we lose variation if we go from the municipality to the county. All counties at some point had refugees in these 6 months in 2015 and 16. So we don't have a counterfactual anymore. But aggregating at the lower level is a very good point. It's not so easy. I think that's why we haven't done it so far, because we like getting all the geolocations of all email we have sent. So we have the zip codes, but we don't know where they are located in the zip codes. It's not
so the zip code corresponds to municipality, basically.
Exactly. And it's not impossible to get the geolocation, but I think I would need a couple of student assistants to help me with this. But it's a very good point.
I think it's really worth the exercise. I would really strongly recommend to do this.
Because, I mean, we have one manipulation check kind of that we think, because we kind of measures that people had contact, because we have a survey which was done 1 year after the refugee crisis in 2017 among a representative set of our municipalities. And we find that the municipalities who hosted refugees, they do, so there were questions, do you have contact, do you know that they are here, etc. So the people they were 2 years later, they were really aware that those people were here. So at least that we know, but I totally agree, some spatial proximity obviously can matter a lot if you had meaningful contact to some extent. So yeah, thanks for your question. I think I have to get some student assistance then. All right.
We can quickly do one more question.
Okay, yes.
Xiao Yu has a question.
Yes. Maybe.
Oh yeah, sorry, I have to unmute myself.
Yes.
So I was wondering, when people receive this email and they see this foreign name, or do they think this is a person that is an immigrant or a refugee, or they think this is somebody from an ethnic group from the society?
That's a good,
right? Yeah.
So our aim was that it signals type of immigrant refugee identity, and that's what we aim to double check in an online survey we did before. So we recruited 200 people. We gave them a list of names because we also hadn't selected our final names, and double checked what identity they kind of infer from this name when they see this name. And then we went for the name which a high majority basically perceived this name as a type of refugee, immigrant type of person. And so we are quite confident for the majority of people, it should signal the same through this double checking before we send the emails. That's a good question, yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah,
and make
one
this clearer.
more question also about the details. So when there's responses, did you also check the content of the responses? Because sometimes if I send an email to a public office, I get an automatic reply immediately. So like, do you only count the ones that actually provide the information?
Exactly. So the automatic replies we did not count. And sometimes after 2 days, there comes the real reply after the automatic reply. So automatic replies are out of our data set. And we did so far not code the tone of the email or the words, because yeah, we now have 25,000. The database is very large, and we still have to extract them, and it's not so easy, and there are so many email accounts, but that's a step we are going to. There's one thing we have coded so far is response time. So we checked a little bit if people are quicker to respond. And what we see, maybe is a little insight I did not present it, is generally there's not a big difference in response time. It's always a little bit the same, except that people respond quicker to people with a doctoral degree. But there's no difference if you're local or foreigner with a doctoral degree. But it's borderline significant. But you can see the little that people seem to, so if they make the decision to discriminate, to not respond, they probably make it immediately. But if you have a doctoral degree, it does not change that you get a response. But if you get a response, you get it quicker. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for this question. Cool. All right, Philip, I think we have to close the session.